Richard Pryor was my hero, and I'm proud to say my friend. Richard and I were friends until his last day on this earth. And Howard, at the end of his life, there weren't a lot of people hanging around kissing Richard's ass.
He took care of Richard Pryor. He was there. He sat with Richard Pryor more than anybody. I met Richard Pryor at the ABC Comedy Awards. I was the first, when I met him, when I got through hugging him and we talked, I went behind the bar, I cried for 20 minutes.
Steve Harvey and Tim Reed, they all try to look like Richard Pryor. And when I said, y'all trying to be Richard Pryor, all of them. And they got over by it. They were successful.
Arsenio Hall has dropped some jaw-dropping revelations about what truly happened to Richard Pryor. But could it be more than just tragic circumstances?
Richard's looking at him, and Richard said, I think he kind of looks like me. He does, the fro, because Steve had his fro back there. I said, yeah. And he says, I met him once. I liked him.
Rumors have long circulated about Pryor being sacrificed by those close to him, and Steve Harvey's name keeps coming up.
Found Steve, put him in a car, brought him to Richard's, left him in the room, let him and Richard talk for 2 hours.
Could it be that Harvey, once a close friend and admirer of Pryor, had deeper connections to his downfall?
At the end of his life, there weren't a lot of people hanging around kissing Richard's ass.
But there's another layer to this story, one that could be even darker. Was Steve Harvey's rumored lust for Richard Pryor just admiration or something more? And could their complicated relationship have played a role in Pryor's tragic end? The answers might be hiding in plain sight.
Steve Harvey and Tim Reed, they all try to look like Richard Pryor. And when I said, y'all trying to be Richard Pryor, all of them. And they got over by it. They were successful.
Richard Pryor's legacy as one of the greatest comedians of all time is unquestioned. But behind the laughter lies a darker story, one filled with betrayal, rumors of affairs, and whispers of sacrifice. What really happened to Pryor? Was his death just a tragic accident, or was there something more sinister at play? Arsenio Hall and Richard Pryor shared a close and wild friendship that lasted until Pryor's final days. However, the nature of their relationship has been the subject of countless rumors and controversies, with Hall revealing some shocking details about the lengths of their bond. The most controversial of all, Arsenio himself might have unknowingly played a role in what some suspect contributed to Pryor's tragic downfall.
You gave me, man, one of the great memories of my life, man. You took me, I had met him before, but you took me to Richard Pryor's house.
During a performance at the Comedy Store in 2022, Hall shared an eye-opening story about his first experience with nose candy, and the man responsible for it was none other than Richard Pryor. As Hall told it, the two were hanging out in the back of the legendary comedy venue when Pryor handed him a rock of cocaine and a $100 bill, encouraging him to try it. Arsenio, hesitant at first, eventually caved, marking his first ever encounter with the drug. What made this moment even more surreal was the fact that Stevie Wonder was playing the piano nearby, completely oblivious to what was happening. Hall later joked that Wonder probably thought they were just fighting allergies. While Hall laughs about the incident today, this moment wasn't just a wild anecdote. It was part of the darker side of Hollywood, where addiction ran rampant. Arsenio's introduction to cocaine by Pryor paints a picture of the chaos and self-destructive habits that surrounded Pryor in his later years. Many believe this chaotic lifestyle, filled with drugs and dangerous choices, may have accelerated Pryor's death in 2005. Was Arsenio unknowingly involved in something that ultimately led to his friend's demise? Hall has always spoken highly of Pryor, calling him both a mentor and a friend. Their bond remained strong even as Pryor's health deteriorated in the last years of his life. In an interview with Howard Stern, Arsenio revealed that when most of Hollywood turned their backs on Pryor, he stayed by his side. He often took Pryor out to see the latest movies or brought over close friends like Steve Harvey and Quincy Jones to keep Pryor's spirits up. But one meeting between Steve Harvey and Pryor stands out, raising even more questions about their relationship.
I met Richard Pryor at the ABC Comedy Awards. I was the first, when I met him, when I got through hugging him and we talked, I went behind the bar, I cried for 20 minutes.
According to Hall, the two men spent hours alone talking about who knows what. Could this meeting have revealed deeper connections between Harvey and Pryor, perhaps something that influenced Pryor's later years? What exactly was said in that room has been left to speculation. What remains clear is that Pryor's life was filled with both brilliance and tragedy, and the people close to him, like Arsenio Hall, were witnesses to both. But with Hall's involvement in Pryor's introduction to cocaine, could he have inadvertently contributed to Pryor's spiral? And what role, if any, did Steve Harvey play in Pryor's final days? Well, John Witherspoon, another close associate of Pryor, has his own suspicions, especially when it comes to Steve Harvey. Witherspoon's words have fueled rumors that Harvey had more than just professional admiration for Pryor. John Witherspoon said in an interview that Steve, among a couple of other comedians, did intentionally try to look like Pryor.
He almost birthed them. Like, I feel like, Eddie Murphy wouldn't be Eddie without Richard.
Well, I think a lot of them try to even look like Richard.
Right.
A lot of them cats, Steve Harvey and Tim Reed, they all try to look like Richard.
You see, from the very beginning, it was so obvious that Steve Harvey had a soft spot for Richard Pryor and even wanted to be like him. That's right. Although both men are professionals in their fields and have always been, you could easily see just how close their jokes were to each other. This was seemingly so clear that if you heard them tell the same joke, you might have trouble guessing who told the joke. Here's what I mean. In an interview from several years ago, Richard Pryor spoke on the culture shock of white people realizing that black people converse in ways that seemed unorthodox to them.
When they found out could talk other than do-wah-ho, they got scared to death. Like one day somebody said, talk. Well, mother, I've been wanting to tell you something. I beg your pardon?
Interestingly, not long after Pryor's interview gained more attention, Steve shared a joke that was quite similar, with a slight twist in the delivery.
You know how many ways we got to say hello? It'll take up 5-6 pages. Yeah. Hey, now! What up? Hey, look here!
Weird, right? Anyway, apart from both comedians sharing a similar knack for making people laugh, there are a couple of other facets of Pryor's life and personality that Steve appears to have adopted. It came to light that Harvey may have shaped his appearance and talents based on how Richard Pryor lived, as Harvey deeply admired the iconic comedian. Meeting Pryor in person only solidified Harvey's love for the comedian. In the realm of celebrity encounters with their idols, there are often tales of disappointment. Fortunately, this wasn't the case for Steve Harvey, who had the privilege of meeting his comedy hero, the profoundly influential Pryor, without any unfortunate outcomes. While some fans might not recall Harvey's early days as a stand-up comedian before his successful foray into film and television, the roots of Harvey's humorous tales and clever punchlines can be traced back to the legendary influence of Pryor.
When I first met Richard Pryor, I have the picture of the day I met him. It was at the ABC Comedy Awards in 1995.
The host comedian took to his Instagram stories to recount his encounter with his comedy hero, sharing, "This lady said, 'Steve, do you know who you're standing in front of?' I said, 'No. Who?' She said, 'Turn around.' I turned around and it was Richard Pryor. I bent over, shook his hand. He said, 'I heard a lot about you. You pretty funny.' I said, 'I love you, man. I thank you.' Because he was the whole reason I got in comedy, I got through talking with him. The ABC Comedy Awards were in this huge hangar they had decorated. I went behind the bar, cried for 20 minutes. Steve Harvey's narrative about meeting Richard Pryor provides a glimpse into the profound influence the late comedian and stir-crazy actor had on his fellow comedians. In any case, on his website, Steve also revealed that when they met, Pryor poked his behind with a knife. The first time I met Richard Pryor, he poked me in my A with the butt end of a butter knife. He said, "You just gonna stand your A in my face?" Many people claim that that incident might have been Pryor's way of shooting his shot at Steve. Anyway, one person who confirmed that Richard actually engaged in gay intimacies was his wife, Jennifer Pryor. According to Jennifer Pryor, Richard Pryor was not shy about embracing his desires, regardless of gender.
It was kind of surprising how open she was, but she said Richard had no shame in this either, and he was actually very... He also kind of said that, it was the 70s, that's when the drugs were still good, a lot of Quaaludes were going around at these parties.
The charismatic comedian reportedly engaged in amorous encounters with both men and women. And hold on to your hats, folks, because one of those rendezvous was allegedly with none other than the enigmatic Marlon Brando. It's the Hollywood crossover that no one saw coming, but now it's making waves like never before. And guess who had spilled the tea about this shocking liaison long before Jennifer decided to lift the veil? None other than music mogul Quincy Jones. In a sensational twist, Jennifer confirmed the veracity of Quincy Jones' claims that Richard Pryor and Marlon Brando had a passionate fling. If you thought the world of showbiz couldn't get any more jaw-dropping, think again. Jennifer Pryor, speaking exclusively to TMZ, revealed that her late husband would have been utterly unfazed by Quincy's revelations. She dishes that Richard was always upfront and candid about his bias with his close circle of friends. It turns out that this larger-than-life comedian wasn't just making audiences laugh, he was living his truth, and he didn't shy away from it. Jennifer Pryor tantalizingly hinted that she possesses a treasure trove of diaries that Richard meticulously maintained. These diaries allegedly contain a vivid chronicle of his experiences, desires, and intimate encounters. Jennifer alluded to the possibility of publishing these diaries later. Could this be the tell-all of the century, destined to leave Hollywood A-listers quaking in their designer boots? As for the alleged affair between Richard Pryor and Marlon Brando, Jennifer had a saucy retort that encapsulates the wild spirit of the 70s. She nonchalantly stated, "It was the 70s. Drugs were still good, especially Quaaludes. If you did enough coke, you'd F a radiator and send it flowers in the morning." Her words paint a picture of a time when inhibitions were tossed aside, and the Hollywood scene was a playground of hedonistic indulgence. What's more, comedian Marlon Wayans responded to Jennifer's claims about Pryor's S. Marlon seemed to have his own take on the situation, and he didn't hesitate to share it. In the abrupt interview, TMZ pointed out that Pryor's widow had given her seal of approval to Quincy Jones' bombshell revelation about Brando's involvement with her late husband. But here's the kicker. Marlon was quick to suggest that Pryor, a man of discerning taste, had quite the eye for companionship. After all, according to Wayans, Pryor had been relatively forthright about his own experiences with bi-S. However, there have been contradictions to these claims. Days after Jennifer spilled the tea on Pryor's love life, Rain, the daughter of Pryor and his second wife, Shelley Bonus, denied the alleged affair, posting an impassioned post about her father on Facebook, slamming both Jones and Pryor's widow as bottom feeders. All you who touted faux news and preach about wanting blacks to be represented in a great light and then posted Q's interview are irrelevant and full of your own BS. Rain wrote, Q was once a brilliant music producer who is losing his mind and decided to garner publicity for himself with a sensationalized interview. And because y'all think and equate fame and money with decency, you ate it up like thirsty dogs. As he spewed out a lie about my father who's not here to defend himself. Then on top of it all, my dad's so-called widow validated it because she needs to keep legitimizing herself and tarnish our dad even after he's dead, Rain continued. Rain ended her note, letting her fans know that she wouldn't be putting up with hearing the news and would be quote-unquote getting my millions the correct way with integrity. Y'all so thirsty and love them, but ever know the real source or full story, and you're gonna wonder how 45 became president? Wake up, she wrote. So read this. I don't need you as a fan or a friend. I don't need anyone in my life that thinks a sensationalized interview is relevant and incredibly well done, Rain added. People who lie or share information to raise themselves up are bottom feeders no matter how much money or influence they have. Wrong is still wrong. Brando's son also disputed claims that his father had an intimate relationship with Pryor. Brando's son, Miko, told TMZ that his family is disappointed after hearing the rumors. The Marlon Brando family has heard the recent comments by Quincy Jones, and we are disappointed that anyone would make such a wrongful comment about either Marlon Brando or Richard Pryor, said Miko, Brando's oldest living son. In any case, Pryor's life was anything but smooth.
You were 15 years old
14.
When your first child was born?
Yeah.
My Lord.
Yeah.
How could you,
It was fun.
Was it?
Oh, man, are you kidding? In the garage?
And then after she was born?
I didn't know my father was...
In fact, before he got so famous to the point of having his S-life being debated publicly, Pryor had the most heartbreaking life ever. They say a mother is a child's first teacher, and the home is their first school. But for Richard Pryor, things started off rough from day one. His mother was an escort, and he was born in a brothel run by his grandmother. His father, an ex-boxer, hustler, and pimp. This was the environment Richard grew up in. And believe me, things would only get worse before they got any better. It's hard to pinpoint what was most traumatizing for young Richard. Once he stumbled across a dead baby in a shoebox. On top of that, he grew up surrounded by violence. There were constant bar fights happening next door, and he'd watch his mom and her colleagues working in the brothel. In fact, one time, he even witnessed his mother attacking his father and cutting one of his testicles during a fight. As bad as all of that sounds, things were about to get even darker. When Richard was just 7 years old, he was essayed by a teenage neighbor. And that wasn't the last time. At 14, a Catholic priest abused him too. By this point, it's clear that Richard Pryor had already lived through a lot more pain and trauma than most people would in a lifetime. But despite his dark childhood, Richard discovered something that would change his life. He found out he could make people laugh. It started one day when he was clowning around on a pile of bricks, falling off on purpose to make the women in the house laugh. But what really got everyone rolling was when he accidentally fell into dog poop. Even his usually stern grandmother laughed, and Richard said that moment was the first real joke he ever told. School wasn't exactly his favorite place. He was late all the time. But one of his teachers had an idea that would change everything for Richard. She told him if he showed up on time, she'd let him perform for the class for 10 minutes every week. Richard loved that. He'd do slapstick comedy routines, and his classmates loved it too. It was clear even then that Richard Pryor had a gift for making people laugh. But when Richard was just 10 years old, his mother abandoned him. Some say it happened even earlier when he was only 5, and that she left because his father was abusive. Whatever the exact details, it was Richard's tough grandmother who stepped in and took care of him. Performing in front of people was something Richard realized he loved early on. He got his first real taste of the spotlight when a local theater director cast him in a play. She saw his talent and believed in him. For a while, things were looking up. But as usual with Richard's life, the highs didn't last for long. By 16, his ex-girlfriend had given birth to their child. And if that wasn't complicated enough, she was also involved with Richard's father at the same time. This was the kind of messy home life Richard was dealing with, and unsurprisingly, he got into a lot of trouble at school. By the time he was 14, he was expelled. With nowhere else to turn, Richard worked odd jobs, from janitor work to whatever else he could find. Eventually, when he turned 18, he joined the army, hoping it would bring him some stability. But instead, it brought more chaos. Stationed in West Germany in 1958, Richard didn't stay out of trouble for long. He got into a nasty fight with a white officer who had been making racist remarks to Richard and other black soldiers. They beat him up pretty badly, and even used a knife. Fortunately, the officer survived, but Richard ended up spending the next 2 years in military prison because of it. When he got out, Richard thought maybe marriage would help him settle down. He married a woman named Patricia Price, but it wasn't meant to last. They had a son, Richard Jr., but the marriage fell apart soon after the baby was born. This was just the first of 6 failed marriages for Richard. In 1963, Richard moved to New York City to try his luck at stand-up comedy. He performed alongside some big names like Bob Dylan and Woody Allen in the clubs. One night, he even opened for Nina Simone. Nina later remembered how nervous Richard was. He was shaking so bad, she had to hold him like a baby to calm him down. At first, Richard's comedy was pretty tame. He stayed away from anything too controversial and followed in the footsteps of comedians like Bill Cosby. He even started making appearances on TV shows like The Ed Sullivan Show and The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson.
I see the President Reagan on TV talking, and I don't get angry or nothing. Most people be angry. I just go, I wonder who lets him on.
But something inside him wasn't satisfied. Everything changed in 1967 during a performance in Las Vegas. In the middle of his set, Richard had an epiphany. He stopped and looked around the room at the mostly white audience, then said, "What the F am I doing here?" and walked off stage. From that moment on, Richard's comedy took a different direction. He started using more raw language and talked about real, uncomfortable topics like race, politics, and life on the streets. After that night, Richard's career really took off. He released his first comedy album in 1968 and followed it up with several more, including That Ends Crazy in 1974, which won him a Grammy. Richard's comedy was groundbreaking. He didn't shy away from the tough stuff. He talked about police brutality, racism, and the struggles of being black in America. By 1975, Richard made history as the first black person to host Saturday Night Live. He also had his own variety show, though it only lasted 4 episodes before it got canceled for being too controversial. But through it all, Richard stayed true to himself. After a trip to Kenya in 1979, he vowed never to use the N-word in his act again. He realized how harmful it was, even though it had been such a big part of his comedy. Richard's life was full of ups and downs, and not just in his career. He struggled with addiction and health issues, but he kept pushing forward, even when things were tough. On December 10, 2005, Richard Pryor passed away after suffering his third heart attack. He was 65 years old. In any case, Richard Pryor's comedic genius changed the face of stand-up comedy forever. He didn't just make people laugh, he made them think, addressing tough subjects like race, politics, and personal pain with unmatched rawness and honesty. But despite his groundbreaking legacy, his life and death are now surrounded by rumors and conspiracy theories that threaten to overshadow his accomplishments. Arsenio Hall's recent revelations have added even more fuel to the fire, raising questions about the official story of Pryor's passing. Pryor himself often spoke about the deep sense of betrayal he felt from those closest to him. Were these feelings a warning of something darker to come? And what role, if any, did Steve Harvey, a man who claimed to admire and look up to Pryor, play in the betrayal that many now believe led to his tragic downfall? That we might never know. Anyway, that's it for this video, folks. Bye.